Alrighty, I'm gonna go ahead and get us started. It's just not quite 2 o'clock. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Karen Reish at the Library of Michigan, and this is the webinar on the updates to the Uniform Chart of Accounts. And our speaker today is Alan Panter. He's from Yeo and Yeo. He is a principal in their Auburn Hills office. He's a member of the firm's Government Services Group and Employee Benefits Group as well. And he joined the firm in 2017, and he has 28 years of experience in providing audit and consulting services. He has specific expertise in state and local government, education, and nonprofit organizations, which is quite beneficial to us in public libraries. So we'll let Alan get his presentation ready to go. And as I said before, if you're just joining us, you can ask questions in chat, and when Alan calls for questions, you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask him questions then. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, thank you very much, Karen. I appreciate that. Again, my name's Alan Panter. I'm a principal at Yeo and Yeo, and we're here to talk about the chart of accounts today. The format today, I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation that I will start screen sharing here in a second and walk you through. I've got some slides there. There's not a ton of content, so there's plenty of time here for questions if you have them. I know everybody has. There's some very specific situations, and we may have to address some of those offline. But we're really going to try to give you the broad strokes of what has happened and what public libraries in the state of Michigan need to do to comply with these requirements. So I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. So just by way of giving you an overview and some background information, and really just to help you to understand how the requirements filter down from the legislature and the public acts that we're going to talk about through the Department of Treasury, and how they are going to apply to your library. So we're gonna spend some time walking through those sorts of things, and then we're going to get into the actual funds and activities and account numbers and all those sorts of things. And I do plan on stopping for questions a couple of times, especially in towards the beginning, and then at the end. So that was my plan for how to go through this. Okay, so we'll start with the background and authority for the changes. So the Uniform Chart of Accounts is a system of account numbering for governmental entities that allows uniform accumulation, recording, and reporting of financial information. So in other words, it is a way for governmental entities to record their financial information in a standardized manner that is going to facilitate budgetary compliance. It's going to facilitate certain aspects of legal compliance. It is going to and also give some comparability to the way the annual financial statements are presented. So, of course, the chart of accounts is basically the basis of your general ledger, which of course then rolls up into the numbers that end up being presented in your annual financial statement. So really, that chart of accounts is one of the basic building blocks of that process. So the basic authority for the Uniform Chart of Accounts comes from Public Act 2 of 1968, also referred to as the Uniform Budgeting and Accounting Act, the UBAA. You can see that I've given the MCL citation there, 141.421. So that's out there, and you can refer to it as needed. So the Uniform Budgeting and Accounting Act, it requires a lot of things. It requires, it talks about budgeting for governmental entities. all sorts of governmental entities in the state of Michigan. And it also is the source of the audit requirements. So I think Karen might have mentioned that my main uh, uh, I'm an auditor. That's what I mainly do is I'm an auditor, and that's normally what I do on a daily basis. So Public Act 2 of 1968 basically means that I have a job, and I should have for the foreseeable future. So that's where the legal requirements come from. It defines the the Uniform Chart of Accounts defines what fund numbers should be used, activity and account numbers. So really just gives you a framework to adopt those requirements. It is useful, hopefully useful for budgeting and financial reporting. I know a lot of or most libraries integrate their budgets with their general ledger. So actually uh, entering your budget or having your budget interface from a software package to to the general ledger is definitely a beneficial thing and a best practice for sure. And as I said before, the uniform budgeting or the uniform chart of accounts does allow for comparability across governmental units. So applicability, who does the uniform chart of accounts apply to? It applies to all local units of government in the state of Michigan as that is defined by Public Act 2 of 1968. So a local act or a local unit as defined by the act is a county, village, township, or an authority or commission established by any of the same. Okay, so I know that there libraries in the state of Michigan are established through several different enabling legislative acts. There are, of course, district libraries, three different types of city libraries. There's township libraries. So there's libraries that are created by school districts. So there are several different types of libraries in the state of Michigan that are covered, or there should be covered under Public Act 2, and therefore defined as local units of government. I did put a couple of bullet points in here with some sort of specific information having to do with school districts, because the Public Act does say, it does list a school district as a local unit, and it does say that that a local unit or any entity created by a local unit is in turn a local unit. So, but school districts, of course, have a separate chart of accounts, and that is specified by the Michigan Department of Education, and that is more geared towards their online reporting through the FID process that they have. So a school district certainly would not be scoped into the uniform chart of accounts because they have their own chart of accounts. But the Public Act does not specifically address libraries that were created by school districts. The language that you see in the bullet point there is directly pulled from the Public Act. So it does not directly address school districts. However, I think that if you have any question about whether or not the Uniform Chart of Accounts applies to your library, and based on your governance and the way that you've been established, that you should maybe discuss it with your auditor, but also I think that complying with the Uniform Chart of Accounts is kind of a safe harbor. You really can't go wrong with if you choose to comply with the Uniform Chart of Accounts. I don't think anybody is ever going to tell you shouldn't have done that. So I think that if you take the stance that we're just going to go ahead and comply with it, you know, that's kind of a best practice, and I would definitely recommend that for your library. So, but the applicability of the library, as I said, depends on how it was established. The Public Act does discuss who specifically is responsible, and it's that chief administrative officer of the library. So in most cases, you know, that's going to be your library director. I would think that would be the person that is defined as that chief administrative officer, although the act really doesn't say any more than that in terms um, of who's personally responsible for that. But you know, as a rule of thumb, the responsibility for the chart, I think, you know, it's pretty safe to assume that it'll follow where the audit goes. Of course, a lot of libraries are established as parts of larger organizations. So that would be, for example, a city library. I have a client that has a library that is a discretely presented component unit, and they are included in the city's general ledger. So they don't really have visibility or control over that general ledger that's handled at the city level, but they definitely roll up, you know, through the city. So so the responsibility and the applicability really comes from their uh, position as part of that city reporting unit. So really, you know, if your library issues a separate audited financial statement, you know, the responsibility for compliance with this is your own. And if your library, from a financial reporting standpoint, rolls up through a larger unit, the responsibility is going to rest a little bit upstream from your library. At this point, I'm gonna ask if there's any questions on that.
Alan, one of the questions in chat was, how does this apply to library cooperatives?
Yes, so great question. So, and I do have some slides in here or I do have some bullet points on my slides where I am dealing with library cooperatives. But library cooperatives were created by libraries, of course. So that's kind of a ridiculous thing to say, but the point is that any entity created by a local unit of government is going to in turn be a local unit of government. So the library cooperatives are going to follow the same requirements based on how what entity established them. So if they were established by an interlocal agreement, or well, I know there's requirements, or there's a mechanism for creating a library cooperative, and I definitely think that those library cooperatives are local units of government, because they are pretty much called out or specified. You'll see when we get to the numbers, there are numbers that actually do apply to library cooperatives. Any other questions before we move on? All righty. I'm going to give you a brief history. Yeah, sure.
Before you keep going, someone just posted in chat also, applicability depends on how the library was established. Are you going to address later on the differences between the different establishments?
I was not planning on necessarily establishing that, but one thing that we didn't really mention in the introduction was that so in 2014, I was contracted by the Library of Michigan to author a public library financial management guide, and that financial management guide was then updated again in 2019. So that is posted on the Library of Michigan's website. And in chapter 1 of the guide, there are some resources there in terms of library establishment, and it discusses the different library types and gives some links to the different enabling legislation that the various library types are created under, and also gives a couple of contact numbers at the Library of Michigan, of some folks that can help out with really any questions with library establishment and governance issues. So I know that can be a very complex issue to try to sort through for public libraries. So that information is available in the Public Library Financial Management Guide that's available on the Library of Michigan's website.
Cool. I posted that in the chat for everyone as well.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Ellen.
Great. Thank you so much. Great question. All righty. So a brief history. So of course, the Uniform Chart of Accounts requirement was originally enacted in 1968, as we discussed, and up until 2002, there was a Uniform Chart of Accounts in the state of Michigan, but it was replaced, as we said, in 2002, based on the issuance of GASB 34. So the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, that's the GASB, in about that time frame, probably a couple years before that, issued statement number 34. So statement 34, GASB 34, was a huge change in governmental accounting. It changed really everything about the financial statements and the way that they're presented, and really has become the norm in terms of what you see today in your annual financial statement. So GASB 34, it was a big change for those of you that were around during that time. I'm sure you heard it for years. You heard it before it was coming, and you heard it after it went. And it was a huge change, and it also spawned quite a few further changes. So as the GASB started to move through the post-GASB 34 era, they've been very busy. So over the last 20 years, they've issued statements up to and including GASB 97 at this point. So and also the GASB is also working on they're re-examining the financial reporting model. So in other words, the changes that came from GASB 34, they are considering further changes to those. So be on the lookout for that. That has not been issued yet. They have some position papers that are out there. There's been an exposure draft issued, which is, they issued an exposure draft looking for comments on their proposed standards. So that's been out there. But for the last 20 years, the GASB has been issuing statements, and we've gotten some significant ones, and I just listed 4 or 5 of them here. GASB 54 talked about fund balance definitions. So if you look on your annual financial statements, your fund balance is broken down between non-spendable, restricted, committed, assigned, and unassigned. So that came from GASB 54, and that is now part of how we can look at fund balance now. So GASB 63 brought in the concept of deferred inflows and outflows. So that was something definitely different. That was not there in 2002. So you would not see anything in the chart of accounts having to do with deferred inflows and outflows before the current one. GASB 68 and 75, which I know has caused quite a bit of, it was a lot of work for us as auditors. It was a lot of work for you as public library financial management folks. And, it's had lasting effects also because of the public act escapes me, but the one that came in 2017, where we have to report your pension and OPEB funding levels. And so those have been some significant changes in terms of pension and OPEB. And then GASB 84 with the fiduciary funds. So that GASB 84 was initially supposed to be effective as of June 30th, or as for June 30th going forward of 2020, but that was put off. So your library may have chosen to implement GASB 84 last year, But if you chose to defer it, as was allowed, the GASB issued Statement 95 that allowed governments to defer certain standards that were scheduled to be implemented. So GASB 84 was one of those that was eligible to be deferred. So your library may have chosen to defer the implementation of GASB 84, and so that's also been a significant change in terms of needs to be reflected in the Uniform Chart of Accounts. So all these changes as they were taking place, Treasury could of course see all of that, and they started working on an expanded chart of accounts that they first issued in 2017. And many of us may have seen that. They issued a document that was quite voluminous, and they announced the implementation, which was then delayed, and then based on some input that they received a lot of input. The implementation requirement was rescinded and delayed, and then there was basically the rewritten chart was in turn then again rewritten, and then through an exposure draft process. So they put out exposure drafts. We responded. I provided a response to them on the exposure draft, and the final chart was actually issued in November of 2020. So in preparation for giving this webinar, I actually I talked with Kerry Vaughn from Treasury, and the one thing that he wanted me to assure this audience is that there should be no further significant revisions expected to the chart. So he wanted me to pass along to you that you can look at the current chart of accounts and feel confident that it is not going to experience significant changes. So you can go ahead and implement at this point, which would that would be my recommendation is that all governmental units, not just libraries, really start to look at this chart and make plans to implement this in the fairly near future. All right, so when do we have to do this? What's the implementation schedule? As a baseline requirement, and I'll show you the chart. There's a chart that they have of the dates here. I'll show you that on the next slide. Just as a baseline, it is required for all year ends of October 31st, 2022 or later. So that is so your first, whatever your library's fiscal year is, your first fiscal year end that is at or after October 31st, 2022, you would be required to have implemented the Uniform Chart of Accounts. So that is the minimum compliance requirement. Treasury does recommend implementation as of the beginning of the fiscal year. So that is going to be important, especially if you employ budgetary integration with your software. And so if you implement as of the beginning of the fiscal year, of course, you start with the end of the fiscal year that you need to be at, back up to the beginning of that, and then also, of course, your budgetary processes, can take months. I'm sure most of them do. I'm sure that most of your budgetary processes, may start 6 to 8 months before your fiscal year even starts. So if you can, so just as an example, if your library has a December 31st year end, and that would mean that you would want to implement it as of January 1st, 2021. So did I do that right? I'm sorry, that That's a typo. That would be January 31st, 2022. So as of the beginning of the coming year, you would go ahead and implement. So what that would mean, and I apologize for that, but what that would mean is that if you're integrating your budget with your general ledger, you would need to have this done in time for your budget process to start. So if your budget for your calendar year library starts 6 or 8 months before year end, what that means is we're just about there. I mean, what that means is that you really ought to be looking at these requirements and taking steps to implement now. So really, it's here if you choose to implement as of the beginning of your budgetary cycle. So so that's definitely something to think about. And of course, early implementation of the chart is allowed and encouraged. So definitely, if you so Treasury is definitely recommending that all local units of government implement the chart of accounts um, as early as is really feasible for your unit. So I'm going to advance to the next slide, which is going to show us the actual implementation schedule. And I'm going to ask if there's any questions at this point. All righty, not hearing any questions, I'm going to go ahead and just talk about this this table here. So this table is lifted directly from the Uniform Charter or the release memo actually, and so you can see that on the right hand column there, the deadline of the fiscal year end for implementation, and that's that October 31st, 2022. And then you can see as you read down the column there, that is the fiscal year end for each one of the various potential fiscal years that you can see there. So based on what your library's fiscal year end is, that is the minimum requirement. The recommended implementation date is as of the beginning of the fiscal year. So you can see that there. So as I said, for a calendar year library, you can see the third number down there. The recommended implementation date is January 1st, 2022. And again, I apologize. I'll fix that typo before I send this over to Karen. I'm guessing that there will be some distribution of these slides to the participants or maybe posted on the website. So I'll make sure that I fix that typo there. So, all right. So that's the implementation schedule. Enforcement. So what are they going to do if we don't do it? So first of all, this is the enforcement is based on the audit being submitted to the Michigan Department of Treasury. So all local units of government should be having their audits submitted to the Michigan Department of Treasury. That is done by the independent auditors. Every governmental entity that we do audits for, we submit that. We submit the audit to Treasury for our clients, and that's just a normal part of what we do. In my experience, the reporting of public libraries is somewhat inconsistent. I am personally aware of some public libraries whose audits do not appear to be submitted to the Department of Treasury, and I'm not aware that Treasury has necessarily made any effort to reach out to entities that they are probably aware of that do not submit their audits through Treasury. But I can tell you that I've taken over audits and I've taken over clients where the library was not being reported or submitted to the Department of Treasury, and of course we started submitting that to Treasury. So as part of that process, We as the auditors, we submit what's called the auditing procedures report, or the APR. You may hear us talking about. So the APR is basically a summary for Treasury of the audit results. So we list on there, what kind of opinion did we give? Almost always it's an unmodified opinion. And then, they ask certain compliance questions. They ask about budget overages, and they ask about illegal acts and fraud, and they ask about, you know, um, several different things on policies that your library has. Does your library have an investment policy and some of the various required policies that the state has? So they ask us all these questions, and one of the questions that they ask us is, um, does the local unit of government comply with the Uniform Chart of Accounts? So the auditors will check that box, yes or no, on the auditing procedures report. Now, based on when when Treasury receives the audit and the audited financial statements and the APR from the auditor, they have a tendency to then reach out to the local units when they have concerns about compliance. So they routinely send out letters for violations that are reported of the Budgeting Act. So that's Public Act 621 of 1978. Public Act 621 basically says if you're over budget by $1, that is non-compliance with the Public Act. I believe that Treasury expects us as auditors to report all instances of non-compliance with statutes. I believe that is their desire that we do that. I can tell you though that in practice, I'm in a service business, so I am trying to give quality service to my client, and I have a very difficult time with the concept that I'm to report immaterial non-compliance with state statutes. So I think that you'll get some differing opinions among auditors on these subjects as to what's to be reported. So I would definitely consult with your independent auditor on that, and to ensure that what's being reported is appropriate. So the auditing procedures report is directly from the auditors to the state. So it's not something that the library is going to see on the front end or approve or anything like that. But when certain things get reported by the independent auditors, Treasury does reach out and ask for corrective action plans when they notice non-compliance, when they see non-compliance. Are there any questions about that? Okay, so what resources are out there to help you understand, what these requirements are? Where are these requirements? And I really just want to. I'm going to switch right now over to Treasury's website, but I listed in the slides here exactly how to get to where I'm going to take you. So I'm going to take you here in a second to the Bulletins, Manuals, and Forms website on Treasury's website. So that is, you can see that you go to Treasury's main page, you click on Local Government, then Community Engagement and Finance, and then the Bulletins, Manuals, and Reports and Forms. So that's where I'm going to take you, and that's where the actual Uniform Chart of Accounts. And I'm going to actually give you a quick tour of the document so that you've actually seen it and maybe understand some of the navigation of it a little bit. And so we'll go ahead and do that now. So this is Treasury's website, and you can see that there are other things here besides the Uniform Chart of Accounts. So there's audit guides for transportation authorities, county road commissions. There's a uniform reporting format. There are manuals for audits of local units of government. There's the accounting procedures manual, budget manual. The budget manual is pretty old. It's definitely something that I think that they're probably going to be looking at revisions for. But the uniform chart of accounts is here, and so as you can see that, and on the right hand side there, you can see the related materials. So there's the release memo, frequently asked questions, the implementation date. The implementation date there is exactly what I showed you on the slide a few previous, and then they give some information on what the revisions are. So I'm going to just go ahead and I am going to actually share a different page. I'm not going to try to download a 180-page document. So I'm going to stop my share here for a second and go over to the actual chart of accounts. So this is the actual uniform chart of accounts. And as you can see at the top here, it's 192 pages. One of the previous versions of this was actually over 300 pages. So one of the things that was shared back to Treasury was, you know, the length of the document was just far too much, and it was just far too difficult to use in the format that it was originally released. So I'll just go ahead and start through this. So the first couple of pages, a table of contents, and then it goes right into section 1. So the table of contents in here, this is really a nice feature, is clickable. So you can navigate around the document. So if you want to go ahead and see what the fund numbers are, you can click on that. And you can kind of run through these fund numbers here. And then at the bottom of every page, there's a link back to the table of contents. So you can jump around in this document pretty easily. And so I think that is that's a nice feature. And they give you some real practical information here in terms of, and we're going to basically go over what you see on the screen here. We're going to basically go over this in the next few slides. So so definitely I think this document it's pretty well written, and it's very accessible. It's very easy to use. You know, bear in mind that it is intended to apply to all units of government across the state. So you know, that is going to encompass an awful lot of different types of entities, including public libraries. So there's going to be a lot of this that's not going to apply to you as public libraries. But just bear that in mind when you're working with these documents. So anyways, that's the brief tour of the document, and just to show you where to find it. And I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. All right.
A quick question for you, Alan. One of the questions in chat was, does there happen to be a sample set up for library?
Not necessarily, but as you're going to see as I go through my slides here, I've pulled out what's relevant to the libraries, and I'm going to specifically discuss that here in a second as I get into some of the real meat of this requirements. So yeah, there is.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just to give you I know that you know there are probably those on the call that are very familiar with you know, fund accounting requirements and very familiar with you know, how that all works. But there's probably a lot, you know, some on the call who are not really you know, familiar with that. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about those requirements. So the GASB defines what type of fund needs to be used to account for certain activities. And the GASB definitely recommends that, and I recommend also, using the fewest number of funds possible for your accounting system. So if I've seen some entities, and you know, it tends to be some of the larger ones, like maybe a county, you know, have really a lot of funds and a lot of funds. And you know, it would definitely be a recommendation and a best practice to cut that down to as few as you can possibly have. So basically, funds are broken down into three different categories. So you've got your governmental funds, your proprietary funds, and your fiduciary funds. And I'm just going to run through these really quickly, just so that you have a little bit of background to the discussion. So the general fund, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. That is the fund that is used for all of your activity, unless that activity is required to be accounted for in a different fund than the general fund. Okay, so that is that, you know, there's an awful lot of libraries that have one fund, and that's their general fund. So so that's pretty straightforward right there. Special revenue funds are funds that are supported by, and this gets back to GASB 54, committed or restricted revenue streams. So in other words, an external funding stream that is restricted or committed to a certain purpose. So I know a lot of libraries have gift funds, for example. So that could be a special revenue fund, because those funds are derived from external sources that are they're restricted or committed. So restricted is an outside restriction. That is the outside donor saying to the library or the local unit, this is what you have to use this money for, and you can only use it for that purpose. Okay, so committed is based on action of the body charged with governance. So in other words, that's generally your library board of trustees. So the board of trustees can commit certain revenue sources to certain purposes, and in that scenario, you could establish a special revenue fund. So that's very commonly seen in governmental entities and libraries, of course, as well. The other types are also there. Capital project funds. So the capital project fund can be established by the library for the purpose of accumulating funds necessary for major capital improvements, and also for carrying out those capital improvements. So if your library is setting aside funds for a new roof or a new building, or you know, whatever it is that your capital needs are, a capital project fund can be established. That fund can be you know, the sources of the money can come from the general fund. It can come from a, you know, a bond issue, or you know, there's a wide variety of sources. Debt service fund, that's for the payment of bonded debt. And permanent funds, that's an endowment fund. So I know that there are libraries out there that have an endowment. That would be an external endowment. So that would be if somebody made a bequest to a library and asked that the principal be kept intact. So that would be an example of a permanent fund. Proprietary funds are not that common in libraries, although I do have one client that has an internal service fund based on their participation in a self-insurance plan through another government that they're affiliated with. So it does happen from time to time. So there are, you know, some internal service funds, and then there's the fiduciary funds. So those are funds that are held by the library on behalf of someone else. So another entity, another, you know, group of individuals, you know, your friend's organization, you know, something like that is, you know, would be a fiduciary fund. And also pension OPEB trusts, and then private purpose trusts. So that's a little bit different from a permanent fund. So a permanent fund is an endowment that benefits the library. A private purpose trust would be an endowment that benefits some other purpose than the library's operation. So, so that's there as well. Okay, so that's your overview of fund accounting, and that really just helps us frame the discussion of, you know, what what fund numbers and what structure do we need to use. All right, so the chart of accounts structure is 3 sets of 3 numbers. So pretty simple, really. So the fund is the first set, the activity is the second set, and the account is the third set. So I think the fund is pretty self-explanatory. We've kind of already talked about that. The activity, excuse me, is again, the chart of accounts is geared towards, it's very broadly written in terms of various governmental entities and the activities that they carry out. So the activity of a public library is defined as recreation and cultural. Okay, so and that is as compared to say a county, for example. A county is an organization that's engaged in a wide range of functions. So they have general government. So that's the treasurer and the clerk and the courts, although the courts are going to be changed to the judicial function. But they also have public works, and they have community and economic development, and they're engaged in functions, and they also have recreation and culture. So that they have, but their use of that, I mean, they could have a library, of course, but they have parks, a lot of times. So that when we talk about functions, it's really in more of a broader sense than what you might think in terms of your public library. And if I, 1 second here. Thanks, sorry. All right. So, but a concept that they've included with the chart of accounts is the ability to what they call point off. So that is how you would create departments. So I know a lot of libraries, especially the bigger the library, the more complexity you're going to have in your chart. You may want to have the ability to create departments within the library. So circulation department, adult services, children's services, however your library is organized. You can establish that department within your chart of accounts by what they call pointing off of the account number, and I'll show you an example of what that means here in a slide or two. So, but they do allow that for the activity and the account numbers. The account numbers, you can see I gave a few bullets here. There are different account numbers for balance sheet accounts. So in other words, that's your assets, liabilities, and fund balance. Deferred inflows and outflows, those are all balance sheet accounts. Your revenues and your expenditures, they all have separate account numbers. And again, you can point off your accounts for more detail as needed. All right, fund numbers. So in a standalone library, such as a district library or a library cooperative, you would use fund number 101. Okay, so that is your general fund. If your library is part of a larger entity, such as a city, you would use fund 271 for the library fund. And I also listed some other commonly used funds here, or funds that are actually called out in the chart of accounts. So, and I used the actual names. You may have slightly different names for your funds, but these names that I've listed here are exactly how they appear in the uniform chart of accounts. So there's the building debt fund, so that's a debt service fund. Building fund, so that would be a capital projects fund, 471. Retirement system fund, so that's a fiduciary fund. So if you have or participate in a retirement system, if you have your own retirement system, that would be a 731. If you have your own OPEB plan, that would be a 737. So other post-employment benefits, that is OPEB. So that would be 737. And then some governments actually post, or they actually keep track of some of the full accrual basis. So, of course, GASB 34 introduced the concept of fund level statements and government-wide level statements. Okay, so of course, governments routinely and daily use fund accounting for everything that they do uh, throughout their fiscal year. At the end of the fiscal year, and mainly through the audit, I mean, this is something that we as auditors generally help our clients with, is convert those statements from that fund level modified accrual basis to the full accrual basis government-wide statements. Now, those adjustments that are made in converting from your modified accrual to your full accrual basis are not required to be entered into your general ledger. But some libraries, some governments, I know, do like to track those adjustments and track those balances that end up in the government-wide statements. So if your library does elect to record those adjustments, you would use the full accrual accounts, and they just give a range in the chart for those accounts. It would be something numbered 900 or higher would be those full accrual accounts that you could employ to record those kinds of adjustments.
Alan, there's a couple questions in chat.
Alrighty.
One is, if they have a technology fund that's a capital projects, do they pick an open number, or do they use a 401 capital projects fund?
Yeah, I would say that you would use, if you only have one capital project fund, you can use that 471 for it. It's titled the Library Building Fund, but I think it can be broadly interpreted as a capital projects fund. If you have multiple capital projects funds, there are open numbers in that range. So I think you could use 472, 473, something like that, for an additional capital projects fund.
Okay. Somebody has asked if we've paid off a building debt, do we need to go back and update the account on the chart of accounts for the auditors to find it for future reference?
Okay, so if once so the state of Michigan requires that so debt service funds are very narrowly restricted to use in the servicing of the debt. So you can pay the principal, the interest, of course, on the debt, any bond issuance costs, those sorts of things. That can come out of your debt service fund. And a lot of times, the debt service fund is funded through a tax levy. So if you have a bond that your voters approve and they have a levy, those tax dollars can go into the debt service fund. Alternatively, they can also go into the general fund and be transferred to the debt service fund. But so you've got your revenues and expenses. So, but the reason I kind of back up to answer the question is, once the debt is paid off, debt service funds are generally closed, or they should be closed. When there are remaining proceeds from debt, those proceeds can be applied to existing obligations. So if you have one debt issue where you have a levy, or you have a revenue source, but you can use any remaining funds in that debt service fund to pay a different obligation of the library. But in some situations where you don't have any additional debt, that money can be transferred to the general fund. But of course, you would stop, levying the tax at that point, of course. So generally, I would think that debt service funds get closed, and at least become dormant in your accounting system after the obligation is satisfied. Um, did, did that address the question?
For me, it did. And Kay Rushlow, if you want to unmute or just say something more in chat. While she's doing that, there were two other questions.
Sure.
One says she's a new director, and they're not using. She says their current system is not on this account at all. We have a separate bank account. Excuse me, we have a separate bank account for payroll. Will I keep payroll as 101, or is there a general fund number specifically for payroll?
Yeah, so a payroll account can be those accounts can be set up in your system as you can have a separate account for your cash account for your payroll and your the net pay, and of course the payroll withholdings that get withheld from employees. So that activity can all happen in the general fund. There used to be, before GASB 84, some governmental entities would establish a fiduciary fund for payroll, but under GASB 84, that's no longer allowed because fiduciary funds are specifically used to account for activities that do not benefit the actual operations of the library. So those payroll funds are, as we as independent auditors help our clients implement GASB 84, those payroll funds that used to be fiduciary funds are now going away. Now, from that's more of a financial reporting perspective. From a managerial or accounting perspective, a fiduciary fund, you could set up a fiduciary fund and operate it throughout the year as such. So in other words, you could have a payroll fund that is established as a 700 fund, so in that range, and then at the end of the year that activity could be folded back into the general fund. So that is something that I have one client that we do that for, where they actually operate that fund as a fiduciary fund, but then for financial reporting purposes it gets reclassified back into the general fund. So there's definitely some options there.
The last question I think that will catch us up is a township library would use the library fund, not general fund, correct?
If the township library actually rolls up through the township and is included in their audit, yes, it would use the library fund. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty, so that's the fund number. Thank you for your questions. Those are great questions. It's much better to be giving a webinar to 140 people when you get some interaction, and that's terrific. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Okay, some activity numbers. All right, so as I kind of introduced the topic before, the activity numbers is the second set of numbers. So you got your fund, your activity, and your account. There are, you can see that in the middle of the page there I listed, what the library function is and the library board. So 790 and 791. I would typically expect to see 790 in most libraries, and 791 would be that library cooperative. But there are certainly accounts where, the activity is not relevant or needed. And that would be a balance sheet account or a revenue account in most situations. So, your balance sheet accounts, and that would be your cash and your accounts receivable and accounts payable and your fund balance and all those sorts of things. So those are not specifically associated most of the time with a certain department or function, okay? And in that situation, you can use the generic 000 for the activity. So most balance sheet and revenue accounts you're going to see have the fund number, so 101, and then the next one, or 101 or 271, or whatever your fund number is, then that 000, and then your account number. Okay, and we'll talk about the account number here in a second. But on the expenditure side is really where the use of the activity number comes in. So definitely going to use it for expenditures. And as I said, you know, the revenues, you're only going to use that if you're tracking revenues by department. And I don't see that very often. I don't see revenues tracked at that level. So it's mostly really just at the fund level, unless you did have a specific need to track those revenues by some kind of department code. So then you could use that activity number for the revenue accounts. And again, you can point off for different departments within your library activity. So as you can see there, that what we mean by point off is you can see it listed there 790.1, 790.2, and you can go, you know, to infinity there. So so that is how you would create certain departments within the library. So okay, sorry. Okay, so those are, and I'm sorry for the interruption. Somebody just came in the room where I'm at. So okay, so that's your activity numbers. Any questions about that? All right, hearing none, we'll go ahead and I just wanted to show you, and maybe I should have put this slide before the activity slide, but these, oh, I'm sorry. These are the account numbers. We're getting into into the account numbers now. So so again, your chart is basically composed of your fund, your activity, and your account number. So the balance sheet accounts are very specifically described in the chart of accounts. So the cash accounts, the receivables, and you can see the different categories of accounts here. So on the left-hand side, you can see current assets, non-current assets, current liabilities, deferred inflows, all those sorts of things. And then you have some account names. So cash is in the 101 to 117. Cash and investments is 101 or 001, I'm sorry, to 017. And then within that range, the chart does specifically delineate some specific account numbers that they expect to see used there. So, and then it goes down through the list there. So your receivables, inventory, I would differentiate that inventory from like your library collections. At the fund level, I would not expect to see your library collections recorded as an inventory. I do know that a lot of libraries do capitalize those and report those library collections as capital assets, which is totally fine and totally allowed. So I would expect to see it at that level and not here as inventory. So, but you can see, and this table is actually lifted directly from the chart. So when you go in there and you start looking at the account numbers, this is what you're going to see for the balance sheet account. So this definitely gives you an idea of the ranges of numbers. But for the balance sheet, I would very much refer to the chart of accounts to the specific numbers that they want used for those numbers. Okay.
Alan, could you go back one slide? Someone wanted to see that slide again.
All right.
Okay. Okay. And for everyone that is on, you'll get the recording, but you will also get a copy of the slides. So if you need to look at those charts a little more clearly, you'll have that opportunity. Thank you, Alan.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. So, and here's the chart for revenue accounts. So you can see on the revenue accounts, and you'll see the same thing on the expenditure accounts. There's a concept that they have of control accounts and sub-control accounts. Those are basically groupings for your financial statements. Okay, they are not actual components of the account number. So you do not have to put into your system, control accounts and sub-control accounts. Although some systems do have control accounts that exist in either in the background or can be established. It really just depends on your software package and what its capabilities are. But on a basic level, and for most governmental entities, I would not expect to see those control accounts and sub-control accounts actually be entered into your general ledger. But this does just sort of indicate how the accounts at their basic level roll up into the into the financial statements. So that is listed there. So the revenues and the expenditures, the revenues are less defined in terms of specific account numbers that they want you to use. They give more ranges of account numbers for revenues. So you can see that the taxes are listed there. So that's your property taxes mainly that you have are listed as account numbers there. If you have special assessments, licenses and permits, fines and forfeits. So that's your late fees and fines and that sort of thing. That's listed down there under 656 to 663. So interest revenue, it also has its accounts, other revenue, and then other financing sources. So that is it lists a couple of examples there: sale of capital assets, proceeds and sale of bonds, also interfund transfers. If you have the occasion in your library to transfer funds from one fund to another, those are listed as other financing uses and other financing sources. So those are labeled accordingly. On the expenditure side, so as I said, the balance sheet accounts are very closely defined, very, very narrow definitions. The revenue accounts are not quite as narrowly defined, but the expenditure accounts really just have ranges. So there's going to be a lot of variation in what specific expenditure accounts are used by various local units of government. But there's also, as you can see on the left-hand side here, there is the concept of the control accounts and the sub-control accounts. So again, this is really just how you roll up into your annual financial statement. So it shows you your personnel services, that's your salary, your wages, your employee benefits, all those sorts of things are going to be account numbers 702 through 725. And again, you can point off of those for basically an infinite number of accounts that you can have in there. Supplies, other charges or services, capital outlay. So your capital outlay is, your building improvements. If you have, anything that you have to purchase, anything you have to purchase that has a life of more than a year, should be shown as capital outlay. And then debt service, that's your principal and interest. And it also shows other financing uses. And again, that's your transfers out is probably the biggest thing there that you might see. Any questions at this point?
Someone has asked, how many decimal points can you point off?
Yeah, as many as you need to. You can go from 1 to, as far as you need to go, as far as pointing off.
Okay. The second question that I see is the control account the same 3 digits as the activity?
No, it's not. So yeah, that's a good question. The as I said for the revenues, I would not expect to see these control accounts actually integrated with your chart of accounts. So your activity is really going to be, for most libraries, you're conducting one activity. Your activity is the public library itself. So your activity is going to be pretty generic unless you're using that activity to create departments within the library. So, so of course, that would be where you would point off of that 790 activity account. But the activity number and the control account number are not the same thing. But again, I would not expect to see that control number actually show up in your chart of accounts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to give you some examples, and we're almost done here. So just some basic examples of a checking account. So in your general fund, that would, and I just used the general fund 101. I could have used 271 for any of these, but I just used 101 just for the sake of uniformity and ease. So your checking account would be 101-000-001. So that's your checking account. I also listed a point off, 001.1 in case you have a different cash account. Of course, lots of governments have multiple cash accounts, of course. And so that would be the way that you would list your cash accounts. Accounts payable, 101-000-202. Property tax revenue, 101-000-402. Salaries and wages. So that's where we started getting into our expenditures. So 101-790-702. And then I also listed an example here of how you might point off the activity numbers. So 790.1, 702. So that would be if you have, again, your departments. So those could show up there in the activity number. So you could have accounts for wages, a different wage account in every department. So and then of course you can then use that account. If you put all your wages to 702, then you'll be able to see, of course, what your wages are across departments. So within departments, and also across the departments. So that can be useful as well. I'm just going to stop there. Any more questions?
There are a couple more in chat. One of which is, do the decimal points matter? Can they be random? I would presume you're trying to organize using the decimal points, but.
Yeah, the decimal point should definitely follow the prescribed number. So as you can see in these examples here, where I've pointed off an account or I've pointed off an activity, you can see that the decimal is after the required number. So so that the decimal is not randomly placed.
Okay, someone has asked, are book purchases under supplies, other services and charges, or capital outlay? My thought there personally would be supplies, so I'm curious if that's the actual answer.
Yeah, so the chart is silent on this. It really doesn't say, but mostly what I see is that the supplies line would be used. So your expenditure for your books and periodicals and library materials would be somewhere in that supplies area. I suppose if there was a special situation where, a large collection was purchased or something like that, that you would use capital outlay in that situation, but that's probably a fairly narrow application.
Okay, there's a couple more. Someone has asked, they have a pretty detailed budget for materials. They have things like, they've broken it down into things like DVDs and training. So they're wondering how that breaks down with the numbering.
Yeah, I mean, so in that case, I would think that your account would be pointed off. So if you're have those various types of materials that you're purchasing, I would establish an account for supplies, and then I would point off those various other specific items that you're tracking for budgetary purposes. So, you know, you would establish a supply number and then point off as needed.
Okay. Just double checking. There's been a couple more posts here. Um, one question here is, would expense accounts, such as a director debit card, be a point off for a cash account or a different account number?
So so the credit card account can be accounted for in a few different ways. So you can, if you intend to show a balance payable, so in other words, you know, if your credit card, if you owe $5,000 at the end of the month, and you're recording that in the general ledger, I would anticipate that's not an asset, that's a liability. So that's an amount that's owed by the library. So I would expect to see, you see the accounts payable there. I would expect to see that somewhere in that 202 range right there, in terms of the liability side. On the expenditure side, so of course, you know, there's the amount that's owed, but then, you know, you're going to track those expenditures, you know, regardless of the method that you use to purchase it, whether, you know, whatever you're buying, you know, whether it was purchased through a check or, you know, the normal procurement methodologies that your library uses, or if you use your credit card, you're still going to track those expenditures. So from that standpoint, you're going to see those expenditures listed very much in the normal way. So if you're purchasing supplies or, you know, just anything that's needed, you know, maintenance items for the library, you're gonna put those into expense accounts in much the same way as you would for anything else that the library purchases.
Okay. Another question is, do you need board approval to change these numbers, or is it the job of the director?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as I stated before, the Public Act does indicate that chief administrative officer is individually responsible for compliance with the chart of accounts. That being said, I know that, you know, every library that I work with has, you know, a board that's very involved, and they, you know, they're a policy setting board, you know, but there's also a lot of, you know, management issues that are, you know, discussed with. I mean, I would absolutely advise that every library, you know, discuss this with their board of directors, and 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 definitely keep them informed about it. I would have a difficult time foreseeing, you know, a library board, you know, giving, you know, any trouble to management. But I think that in terms of implementation, but I think that at the end of the day, it is the responsibility of that chief administrative officer to ensure compliance with the Uniform Chart of Accounts as required by the Public Act.
Thank you.
Great questions, everybody. All right, I've got some implementation issues, and then I'm just about done here. So, so I would recommend that as you sit down and start to look at this, that you create what I would call a crosswalk spreadsheet. So I would start that as, you know, maybe on the left-hand side is your existing chart of accounts, and, you know, just list it out, and what are the accounts, what are the names, what are the numbers, list them out. And then on the right-hand side to list out what the new chart of account, what the new numbers are going to be. So not all the numbers have changed. So if you were previously following the Uniform Chart of Accounts, excuse me, there will be accounts that don't even change. So that'll be nice. But there will be other accounts that have been renamed, and there will be other accounts that are renumbered, and there will be other still further accounts that you know, were not defined in the former iterations of the chart of accounts that that are now going to need to be defined. So I would recommend the creation of what I would call a crosswalk spreadsheet, and that's going to enable you to kind of visualize the changes, and also communicate those to other folks, such as your independent auditors. So your auditors are going to need to go through and update their financial statements if they're drafting your financial statements for you. Of course, if you're drafting your own, then the auditors wouldn't have to worry about that. You know, you're going to need a mechanism to communicate that to the auditors as well. So I think that crosswalk spreadsheet really would help. It would probably also be very beneficial in terms of, as we mentioned just a minute ago, communicating with your board as far as what the scope of these changes is really going to be for your library. So I think that'll be a good way for you to be able to communicate with others in terms of what changes are being made. One of the other implementation issues that comes out is, and this is probably not as prevalent in public libraries, but I will bring it up because it's I'm sure it's not unheard of, especially in some of the larger libraries, but a lot of governmental entities have historically used what they call an other department for payroll taxes and benefits, as opposed to the idea that those payroll taxes and benefits would be charged out to specific departments. The Uniform Chart of Accounts does contain a requirement that all costs of certain departments be charged to that department. So in other words, they've removed the ability to charge overall costs like payroll taxes and benefits. And I've seen insurance and some other things charged to an other function. But they're saying now, the guidance in the Uniform Chart of Accounts is saying that they want those costs to be actually allocated out to the department. So that is a change in accounting practice that is really being driven by the Uniform Chart of Accounts. So that's definitely something to watch out for. The other thing here is that my third bullet here, you only need to set up the accounts for the activities that you're engaged in. So, I mean, that sounds pretty straightforward, but, you know, if you have dormant accounts, if you have, you know, say a debt service fund for, you know, a debt that's been paid off, you don't have to set that up in your system. You can just leave that out. You don't have to set up a comprehensive chart for activities that your library is not engaged in. So just wanted to point that out. That is actually covered in the frequently asked questions that are on Treasury's website. The other thing is QuickBooks. So some libraries use QuickBooks, and the first thing, just right off the bat, QuickBooks is better than nothing, but I would not recommend it for governmental entities to use. There's a few reasons for that. First of all, it does not handle fund accounting well. So in an environment where you have multiple funds, it does not handle that. You know, the workaround for that is generally what I see is multiple companies set up, so a company for each fund, which is cumbersome at best. So that's, you know, it's really not set up for fund accounting, and I really don't recommend it except for just the smallest of libraries. So I just want to put that out there right off the bat. But to use QuickBooks, you would have to enable, so QuickBooks in its native environment does not require account numbers at all. But it does have the ability to use account numbers. So you would have to actually turn that on in QuickBooks. And the QuickBooks account number is limited to 7 digits. So of course, you know, 3 sets of 3 digits, you know, your normal account, it's 9. I actually asked Treasury about that, and they said that what you would do in that situation is omit the fund number, since QuickBooks, you know, by definition, if you're in, you know, your general fund, that's going to be a company, so you can omit the fund number there in the Uniform Chart of Accounts, and still be considered to be in compliance in that environment. But at the end of the day, I would advise you to go ahead and consult with your software vendor. I know that there are some software vendors that are providing some very good assistance with this in terms of conversion. I know that BSNA, for example, is, they take that crosswalk spreadsheet that I talked about, and they use that to actually convert your account numbers, including the history. So when they're done, your chart of accounts will appear as though it was always that way. So that's a pretty nice service that they provide. And I would definitely advise you to go ahead and have a discussion about this with your auditor as well. What's going to be important to them in terms of this. I mean, compliance is the overriding, factor, of course, but what's their stance on, reporting of non-compliance? I think if you lined up 10 different auditors and asked them the same question about, compliance with that, and what, how that should be reported and if it should be reported, you might get 10 different answers. So I would definitely advise you to consult with your independent auditors. And also, I'm going to offer, anybody on this call who wants to give me a call and discuss the Uniform Chart of Accounts. I'll consult with you. I'll give you a half an hour consultation for no charge. So I'm happy to do that. So I believe that is the end of my presentation. If we have further questions, we can talk about those at this point.
Alan, in the comments, there's some discussion now about QuickBooks, whether or not you're still allowed to use it. So the impression I kind of got was that you can use it, but you're going to have to deal with some issues with it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There is no prohibition against using QuickBooks. The various factors that I listed just a second ago are definitely, plus some usability issues are definitely reasons that you might not want to use QuickBooks, especially in a larger library. Now, I can totally understand where, a library that has one fund, might use QuickBooks very successfully. And at the end of the day, if and I have audited, libraries like that, and it's not an issue. Another thing that I don't like about QuickBooks is you can actually go back and change historical transactions, which of course is not a good accounting practice. That's definitely not an accounting practice that I would recommend to actually go back and change historical transactions. And of course, that also introduces the possibility of fraud. So if you had a fraud perpetrator who was able to use QuickBooks to actually, delete transactions and cover their tracks, that's all just a very, that's not a good way to conduct your financial affairs. So, you can use QuickBooks, but I would be very careful with it.
Does anyone else have questions? Have I missed something in chat that someone would like brought up?
Karen?
Yes.
This is Cindy from Bel Air, and I want to understand this correctly because my auditor's saying it's never been an issue before to have to do this, and now he's going to meet with us in a couple more weeks. Is this a new mandate, or is this something we should have been doing all along? And is this a requirement or a request by the state to follow these counts?
Yeah, good question. So the chart as it's currently embodied was only issued in November of 2020. So of course, the concept of the chart itself has been around since 1968, and there have been various iterations of the chart over the years. So the concept of an actual uniform chart of accounts is nothing new. And if you were to ask the Department of Treasury, they would tell you that compliance is mandatory. So I've heard Carrie Vaughn say that, you know, a uniform chart of accounts is not, it's not uniform if everybody doesn't use it. So so that would definitely be the response in terms of whether or not this is a requirement or a request. I think that the request, or I think that the requirement, excuse me, is definitely grounded in some very easily identifiable state statutes.
Sorry, Cindy, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you. That gives me the answer that I need for my board. Thanks.
Thank you.
There were a couple questions. If there were any other recommendations for software other than BSNA?
Not really. I see Sage once in a while, but honestly, maybe that's a question to ask one of the folks that works for me, because I'm a partner and I don't see that side of it that much. So, yeah, definitely something that is a native fund accounting package. So I would definitely recommend something that specifically supports fund accounting. Something that, when you talk to the vendor and you say, what about fund accounting? And they say, oh yeah, it's a governmental package. I know that there's software packages that, New World Systems has one, but that's a pretty high-end package. Maybe, would be only larger entities would want to go ahead and spend the money for something like that. But there are specific governmental software packages that are out there, and I would definitely recommend something that is designed specifically for governmental entities.
I see there's some questions about library crosswalk examples. I have had a couple people on the webinar send me some in email, and I will send those out when I send the recording.
Perfect.
And if anyone else has something they would like to share with someone on the webinar today, feel free to email it to me and I will share that out as well. Any other questions? Anybody want to jump in? We are at 3:35, so perhaps we can wrap it up. And I expect an email from me with the recording, the slides, and some of the samples people have emailed me. And it was quite generous of Alan to offer to do some consulting. Hopefully that will be helpful for those of you that take it up.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you attending today, and I appreciate the work that you do, and look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting, and if something comes up later for anyone, please feel free to email me.